My name is Delaney Ashworth, and I was 31 years old the night my mother stood up at my father's funeral reception and told 40 people, in a voice loud enough to carry over the clinking of coffee cups, that I wasn't really his daughter. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside. She said it the way you'd announce the weather, like it was a fact everyone deserved to know before the casseroles got cold. My father had been dead 11 days. I had a DNA test already mailed in, sitting in a lab 3 states away, and I had no idea yet that the results would land like a second funeral, except this time, I'd be burying the family instead of him. I should tell you about my father first, because the rest of this story doesn't mean anything if you don't understand who I lost. Daniel Ashworth was 62 when the cancer finally took him, and he had been, for every single day of my life that I could remember, the only adult in that house who looked at me like I was worth looking at. He was an electrician, the kind who got called out at 2 a.m. for emergencies and never complained about it, the kind who came home smelling like solder and exhaustion and still asked how my day was before he asked anything else. He taught me to change a tire in the church parking lot when I was 16 because, he said, no daughter of his was going to stand on the side of a road waiting for a man to save her. He called me Lainey. Nobody else got to call me that. It was his word, carved out just for me, and when he died, I lost the only person on earth who used it. My mother, Carol, was a different kind of weather entirely. She ran our house the way some women run a courtroom, handing down verdicts at the dinner table and expecting applause. My younger brother, Cole, was the favored one, the golden one, the one who could do no wrong even when he very obviously did. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got the leftover affection after Cole had taken his fill. I told myself for years that this was just how families worked, that some kids get the bigger slice and some get the corner piece, and that love was still love even when it came in uneven portions. What I didn't understand, not for the longest time, was that my mother's coldness toward me had a specific shape. It wasn't generic favoritism. It was something sharper, something with an edge she'd been sharpening since before I could walk. I just couldn't see the blade yet because nobody had pointed it at my throat. My father got sick in the spring. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already won most of the fight. I drove the 3 hours back to Millbrook every weekend for 8 months, sat in waiting rooms with stale coffee and worse magazines, held his hand through chemo sessions that made him shake like a man standing in a blizzard. My mother was there too, technically. She brought him soup. She complained, loudly and often, about how exhausting it all was for her. She made his dying about her stamina. Cole visited twice in 8 months. I don't say that to score points against my brother. I say it because it matters later, when you hear what they tried to take from me, and you need to understand exactly how little either of them had earned the right to take it. My father died on a Tuesday morning in October, with my hand in his and my mother down the hall getting coffee she didn't need. His last clear sentence to me, 2 days before the morphine took the rest of his words away, was this: "You were always mine, Lainey. Don't you ever let anybody tell you different." I thought he was just being sentimental, the way dying men sometimes are, reaching for soft things to say because there's no time left for hard ones. I held onto that sentence the way you hold onto a railing on a boat in rough water. I had no idea he was trying to warn me about something specific. I thought it was love. It was also a warning, and I didn't understand that until it was almost too late to matter. The funeral was at Grace Lutheran, the same church where I'd been baptized, where my parents had gotten married 35 years earlier under a stained glass window of loaves and fishes. I gave the eulogy. My voice cracked exactly once on the word Lainey, and I let it crack because some things deserve to break a little in public. Cole sat in the front pew and cried the loud, performative kind of tears that draw eyes toward him rather than toward the casket. My mother sat beside him in black, dry-eyed, composed already. I would learn calculating. The reception was at the house. Casseroles on every counter, the smell of burnt coffee, relatives I hadn't seen since I was a teenager offering me the same 5 sentences of condolence in slightly different orders. I was standing near the kitchen island, holding a paper plate I had no intention of eating from, when my mother's voice rose above the room like a knife coming up out of a drawer. "Well, it's not like she's really his anyway," she said. The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in waves, the way a pond goes still when you throw something heavy into the middle of it, and the ripples take a second to reach the edges. I turned around. My mother was standing by the dining table with a glass of white wine in her hand, looking at me the way you'd look at a stain you'd been meaning to get to. "Excuse me," I said. "You heard me, Delaney." She said my full name like a verdict. "Daniel knew, we both knew, it's not some big secret. You were never really his." My Aunt Patricia gasped audibly. Cole, to his credit or his cowardice, said nothing at all, just looked at his shoes the way men in this family always looked at their shoes whenever something true and ugly surfaced. My father's sister, my Aunt Joyce, who had flown in from Tulsa for the funeral, stood up so fast her chair scraped the hardwood. "Carol," she said, "that is not the time." "It's exactly the time," my mother said, sipping her wine like she was settling a debate about casserole recipes instead of detonating my entire identity in front of 40 mourners. "She's going to find out eventually. Might as well be now, while everyone who matters is already here." I want to tell you I had some dignified response ready. I didn't. I stood there holding a paper plate with a piece of untouched ham on it, and I felt the floor of my own life tilt, sideways the way it does in a dream where you're falling but nobody around you notices. 11 days. My father had been dead 11 days, and the woman who married him had chosen his own funeral reception as the venue to tell a room full of people that I didn't belong to him. "That's not true," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Isn't it?" my mother said. "Ask your Aunt Patricia, ask anyone who knew us back then. Daniel wasn't even sure himself, not at first." Patricia, God love her, did not back her up. She looked horrified, actually, glancing between my mother and me like she was watching a car crash she had no way to stop. But the damage was already loose in the room. I could see it landing on faces, see people recalculating, see the particular cruelty of a rumor that doesn't need to be true to do its work. It just needs to be said out loud in front of enough witnesses. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the paper plate. I set it down on the counter, very carefully, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself to be holding anymore, and I walked out the back door into the cold October air and stood on the porch where my father used to smoke his one cigarette a week, the secret one my mother pretended not to know about, and I shook. Here is the thing about my mother that I need you to understand before this story goes any further. Carol Ashworth did not say things by accident. She did not have outbursts. Every cruel sentence that ever came out of her mouth had been loaded, aimed, and fired with intent. She had waited until my father was 11 days in the ground to say this, which meant she had been sitting on it, nursing it, deciding exactly when it would do the most damage. That wasn't grief talking. That was a plan, finally executing. Aunt Joyce found me on the porch about 10 minutes later. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood next to me in the cold, her own breath fogging in the porch light, and after a while she said, "Your father loved you more than anything on this earth, Lainey. Whatever your mother's playing at, don't you let it touch that." "Is it true?" I asked her. Did he know? Did he doubt it? Joyce was quiet for a long moment, and that silence told me more than I wanted it to. "I don't know what your mother's talking about specifically," she finally said, "but I know your father never once doubted you were his. Not once in 31 years. I'd have known. He'd have told me." I believed her. I still believe her now. But belief isn't proof, and proof was the thing I suddenly, desperately needed, because my mother had just done something no amount of love could undo on its own. She'd planted a question in a room full of witnesses, and questions like that don't stay quiet once they're out. They spread. They get repeated at church, at the grocery store, in family group chats I wasn't even part of. I drove back to my apartment in the city that night instead of staying at the house like I'd planned. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before I went inside, just breathing, just trying to find the bottom of what had happened. And somewhere around minute 30, the engineer part of my brain, the part that had spent 11 years working as a project manager learning to never trust a claim without documentation, finally kicked in over the part of me that was still just a grieving daughter standing in shock. If my mother wanted to make this claim in public, in front of witnesses, at my father's funeral, then I was going to need something more solid than her wine-soaked accusation to stand on. I was going to need facts. I ordered a DNA testing kit that night, one of the mail-in ones that compares your sample against a parent's, except my father wasn't available to swab his cheek anymore. So instead, I did the next best thing. I remembered that my father, ever the methodical man, ever the one who kept records of everything from warranty cards to oil change receipts, had donated blood every single year at the church blood drive, and that 2 years earlier, after a minor health scare, he'd had a full genetic panel done at the hospital as part of a research study he'd volunteered for, the kind that keeps samples on file. I called the research coordinator the next morning, my voice steadier than I expected, and asked what it would take to access his genetic information for a paternity comparison, given that he was deceased and I was his only documented next of kin on the consent form. It would take 6 weeks, she told me. 6 weeks of paperwork, of consent verification, of bureaucratic patience I did not naturally possess. I told her I had nowhere else to be but waiting. While I waited, the family did not. Cole called me 4 days after the funeral, not to check on me, not to ask how I was holding up after losing the only parent who'd ever genuinely shown up for me. He called to ask about the house. "Mom thinks it makes sense to sell," he said, like he was reading from a script someone else had written for him, which, knowing my mother, he probably was. "It's a lot of house for just her. And honestly, Lainey, with everything that came out at the funeral, maybe it's cleaner this way. You take a smaller cut since, well, you know." "Since what, Cole?" I said. "Say it." He didn't say it. He never did. That was Cole's whole strategy in life. Let other people say the ugly things and just stand close enough to benefit from them. "I'm just saying," he said. "Dads will split things between us. But if there's a question about whether you're actually entitled to that legally, I mean, maybe it's worth figuring that out before we go through probate. Save everyone the headache." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because it tells you everything you need to know about what was actually happening here. This had never been about whether I was my father's daughter. My father's love for me had never wavered, not for one single day of his life, and everyone in that family knew it. This was about money. The moment my father died, my mother and my brother had looked at his estate, looked at the will that split everything evenly between his 2 children, and decided that one of those 2 children could be priced out of her own inheritance with a rumor loud enough to plant doubt and a probate process slow enough to let that doubt calcify into fact. My mother hadn't said what she said at the funeral out of grief, or shock, or some long-buried secret finally surfacing. She'd said it because Cole needed her share bigger than mine, and the cheapest way to make that happen was to make the rest of the family believe I wasn't really owed anything at all. I didn't yell at Cole on that call. I'd learned something from my father in those last months in the hospital, something about the difference between reacting and responding. I just said, "Send me whatever paperwork Mom's lawyer drafts. I'll have my own lawyer look at it." And then I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I started a list. Because if there's one thing 11 years in project management teaches you, it's that the people trying to move fast on a bad plan are always counting on you not slowing down to check their math. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Renata Kessler, a probate and estate attorney 2 of my coworkers had used and trusted, sharp-voiced and entirely unimpressed by drama. I told her everything: the funeral, the accusation, Cole's phone call, my father's last words to me in the hospital. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said the sentence that became the spine of everything that followed. "Delaney, paternity has nothing to do with inheritance rights in this state, full stop, unless your father's will specifically conditions it, which I'd be shocked to see. Do you have a copy of the will?" I did. My father had given me a copy himself, 3 weeks before he died, folded into a manila envelope along with a note that said, in his careful electrician's block printing, "Read this when you're ready, not before." I hadn't read it yet. I'd been too raw, too unwilling to look at a document that made his death feel scheduled instead of just devastating. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with Renata's voice still fresh in my ear, I finally opened it. The will was straightforward on its face. Half the estate to Delaney Ashworth, half to Cole Ashworth, with the house to be sold and proceeds split unless one party wished to buy out the other's share. Nothing about paternity, nothing about conditions. My father had written me into that document as his daughter, plainly, permanently, with no asterisk. But it was the letter tucked behind the will, in his own handwriting, that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my own family. "Lainey," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I'm sorry for that, sweetheart, I really am. But there's something I need you to know, something your mother has used against me for 30 years and might try to use against you now that I'm not here to stop her. Before you were born, your mother had an affair. I knew about it. I found out when she was already 4 months along with you, and I had every reason in the world to walk away. I almost did. But then you were born, and I held you in that hospital room, and it didn't matter one bit whose blood was in your veins, because you were mine the second I looked at your face. I never had a paternity test done, Lainey, not because I was scared of the answer, but because the answer never mattered to me. You were my daughter from the first breath you took. I raised you. I loved you. I am your father in every single way that counts, and the law agrees with me on this because I never once disputed it, not at your birth, not in 31 years. Your mother has held this over my head our whole marriage, using it whenever she wanted leverage, whenever she wanted me smaller. I let her because I thought keeping the peace mattered more than fighting her on it. That was my mistake, not yours. If she ever throws this at you, and knowing her, I think she might, I need you to understand 2 things. First, it changes nothing about who you are to me, or who I made sure you'd legally be on every form, every record, every document I ever signed. Second, and this is the part I need you to really hear, I had a paternity test done 2 years ago, quietly, through the research study at the hospital, the same blood draw I told you was for my heart. I did it for exactly this reason, Lainey. I did it so that if she ever tried to use this against you after I was gone, you'd have proof that didn't depend on her permission or her memory. The results are with Dr. Ackerfer at the research office. I am, biologically and in every other way that has ever mattered, your father. Don't let her take that from you twice. I read that letter 4 times before I could move. My father, dying of cancer, exhausted, scared, had still found the time and the foresight to anticipate exactly the cruelty his wife would visit on his daughter after he was gone, and he had armed me against it months in advance. He hadn't told me directly because, I think, some part of him still couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud while he was alive. But he'd left me a paper trail, the same way he'd taught me to leave a paper trail on every job I ever worked. He'd given me receipts. I called Dr. Ackerfer's office the next morning, and this time, with the letter as documentation of consent and intent, the process moved faster than the 6 weeks I'd been told. 11 days later, I had the results in my email inbox, a PDF with my father's name and mine side by side, a probability of paternity calculated out to 99.999998%. Daniel Ashworth was my father, biologically, legally, in every measurable way that science could put a number on. My mother's affair, whatever had or hadn't happened 31 years ago, had resulted in nothing, because the math didn't care about her wine glass accusations. The math cared about what was actually true, and what was actually true was that I had spent 31 years being exactly who my father had always told me I was. I sat with that PDF open on my laptop for a long time before I decided what to do with it. The old version of me, the one who'd spent her whole childhood absorbing my mother's verdicts without appeal, might have wanted to scream it from the rooftops immediately, to call my mother, and read the percentage out loud like a weapon. But my father had taught me something better than that in his last months, something about patience, about timing, about letting the truth do its work in the right room at the right moment, instead of wasting it on a phone call she could just hang up on. So I waited. I let probate proceed. I let Cole and my mother's lawyer draft their paperwork, the same paperwork that, true to Renata's prediction, never once mentioned paternity, because legally there was nothing to mention. The will controlled. My mother's lawyer, a tired-looking man named Gerald Finch who clearly hadn't been told the full scope of what his clients were attempting, sent over a standard division of assets that split everything 50-50, exactly as my father's will required. That's when Cole made his real move. The one I think he'd been building toward since that first phone call about the house. He called me on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the funeral, and this time his voice had lost the script-reading quality and gained something sharper underneath it. "Look, Lainey, I know things have been weird," he said. "But Mom and I have been talking, and we think the fair thing, given the questions about, parentage, is for you to take a reduced share. Maybe 25% instead of 50. We'd still let you keep some of Dad's tools, his truck, sentimental stuff. We just think, legally speaking, it makes more sense given the circumstances." "What circumstances, Cole?" "You know what circumstances. I want you to say it, out loud, to me right now." There was a long pause, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background, low and urgent, feeding him something. "Mom says you're not really entitled to half, since you're not actually his daughter," Cole finally said, and I could hear how uncomfortable he was saying it directly, which told me he knew, somewhere underneath all that cowardice, that this was wrong. "I have a DNA test that says otherwise," I said. "A 99.999998% probability of paternity. Dad had it done 2 years ago specifically because he knew Mom would try this exact thing. He left me a letter explaining it. I have it in writing, Cole. I have his blood work. I have his handwriting telling me he saw this coming." The silence on the other end of that call lasted so long, I genuinely thought he'd hung up. "That's not possible," he finally said, but his voice had lost all its certainty. "It's very possible," I said. "It's sitting in my email right now. Would you and Mom like a copy, or would you like to keep pretending this is a negotiation?" He hung up on me that time, which told me everything I needed to know about how that conversation had landed in the room he was standing in. I called Renata the next morning and told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that has stuck with me ever since. "Delaney, you've just spent 3 weeks being incredibly patient while your family tried to bully you out of your inheritance using a rumor your own father pre-debunked from beyond the grave. I think it's time we stop being patient and start being thorough." We drafted a letter together, formal, on her firm's letterhead, addressed to Gerald Finch as opposing counsel, attaching the DNA results, attaching my father's handwritten letter, and stating plainly that any attempt to alter the agreed-upon 50-50 division of the estate based on unfounded paternity claims would be treated as bad faith interference with a valid will, and would be met with the full available legal response, including a request that the court note the attempted interference on the record. Renata added one more line at the end, almost as an afterthought, though I suspect it wasn't an afterthought at all. A note that any further public statements made by Carol Ashworth regarding Delaney's parentage, given that the matter was now scientifically and legally settled, could potentially constitute defamation, particularly given that such statements had already been made in front of dozens of witnesses at a public gathering. We sent it on a Thursday. My mother called me on Friday morning, and for the first time in my entire life, I heard real fear underneath her voice instead of just control. "Delaney, I don't understand why you're being like this," she said, her voice doing the wounded register she usually reserved for moments when other people could hear her. "We're family. We're trying to figure this out together. You told a room full of mourners at Dad's funeral that I wasn't really his," I said. 11 days after he died, Mom. You didn't try to figure anything out with me. You tried to take half my inheritance using a lie you'd apparently been saving up for 31 years. "It's not a lie," she snapped, and there it was, the old voice, the one that had run my childhood. "I know what happened. I was there." "I know what happened too now," I said. "Dad told me. He told me about the affair, about why he never disputed paternity, about the test he had done 2 years ago because he knew you'd try this. He left me a letter, Mom. He saw this coming. He saw you coming." The silence on her end was its own confession. "He had no right," she finally said, quiet now, the performance gone. "He had every right," I said. "He's the one who actually showed up, for 31 years, while you were apparently planning how to use his death against me before he was even in the ground." She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in my life, my mother had run out of script. The legal pressure did what cruelty couldn't, which was make her stop. Gerald Finch, once he saw the documentation, apparently had a very short and very pointed conversation with his clients, because the reduced share proposal evaporated within the week. Probate proceeded on the original terms. I got my 50%, exactly as my father had written it, exactly as the law required regardless of what anyone's mother said at a funeral reception. But I want to tell you about the part that actually mattered to me more than the money, because the money was never really the point, not for me. The point was the truth, and what I decided to do with it once I had it locked down and undeniable. I requested one thing through Renata before the estate finalized: a formal family meeting at the house, with my mother, Cole, and Aunt Joyce present, where I would share what I'd learned. Not a courtroom, not a lawyer's office. The dining room where my father used to sit at the head of the table, where my mother had once handed down verdicts like a judge who never expected appeal. They agreed, I think because my mother still believed, right up until the moment I walked in, that there was some version of this conversation where she came out on top. I sat at the head of the table, my father's old seat. I'd never sat there in my life, not once in 31 years, and I want you to understand that I didn't do it for theater. I did it because somebody in that room needed to occupy the space my father had left, and I was the only one who'd actually earned the right to. I laid out 3 documents on the table, the way you'd lay out evidence at the end of a long and patient investigation. First, my father's letter, his actual handwriting, his actual words, explaining the affair he'd known about and forgiven 31 years ago, and the test he'd quietly arranged 2 years before his death specifically, because he knew his wife well enough to anticipate exactly this moment. Second, the DNA results, 99.999998%, printed clean, undeniable. Third, the letter from Renata's office, the one that had ended the reduced share negotiation within a week of being sent. "I'm not here to fight about money," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I think anyone in that room expected. "The estate's already settled. I got exactly what Dad's will said I should get. I'm here because I want everyone in this family to understand something clearly, once, so it never has to be said again." I looked at my mother. She was sitting very still, her hands folded on the table, the posture of a woman bracing for impact she couldn't yet name. "Dad knew about the affair before I was born," I said. "He knew, and he chose to be my father anyway, every single day for 31 years. He chose it so completely that he had a paternity test done quietly, 2 years before he died, just so I'd have proof if you ever tried what you tried at his funeral. He didn't do that because he doubted it. He did it because he knew you, Mom. He knew exactly what you'd do once he was gone, and he made sure I wouldn't have to take your word for it. He made sure the truth couldn't be erased, just because you said it loudly enough." My mother's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes right before someone realizes they've lost an argument they thought was already won. "You don't understand what those years were like," she said, reaching for something, anything. "Your father held that over me. Every fight we ever had, he could have brought it up, ended it, humiliated me. He never did." "He never did," I repeated, because it wasn't a weapon to him. It was just a fact about my birth that didn't change how much he loved me. You're the only one in this story who ever tried to use it as a weapon. You used it on him for 31 years apparently, and the second he died, you used it on me." Cole, sitting across the table, hadn't said a word since I'd sat down. I turned to him. "You knew this wasn't really about paternity," I said. "You knew it the second I sent you those results, because your voice changed on that phone call. You knew the whole time this was about getting a bigger slice of the estate, and you were willing to use a lie about who I was to get it." "I didn't know about the test," he said, which was the closest thing to an admission he was capable of. "You didn't need to know about the test," I said. "You just needed to decide whether you were willing to let Mom take something from me that wasn't hers to take. You decided yes. That's the part I won't forget, Cole, not the lie, the decision." Aunt Joyce, sitting at the far end of the table, reached over and put her hand over mine, the way she had on that cold porch 11 days after the funeral. "Your father would be so proud of you right now," she said quietly. "He'd be proud of exactly this. Calm, documented, true." I didn't need my mother's apology that day, and I didn't get one, not really. What I got instead was something better, in its own way. I got to watch the architecture of her control collapse in real time, in the one room she'd always used to build it. For 31 years, that dining table had been the place where she decided who got love, who got blame, who got believed. That afternoon, I sat in my father's chair and laid 3 pieces of paper on the table, and the verdict came back in my favor, not because I'd shouted louder than she had, but because the truth, once it's properly documented, doesn't need volume. It just needs to be true. The aftermath unfolded slowly, the way these things do once the noise dies down and the paperwork finishes its quiet work. The estate closed within 2 months. I used part of my inheritance to do exactly what my father, I think, would have wanted. I paid off my student loans, the ones I'd been carrying since the degree that helped me become the project manager who knew how to slow down and check the math when everyone else wanted to rush a bad decision through. I kept his truck. I kept his gloves, the worn leather pair that still smelled faintly of solder if you held them close enough. I framed his letter, not the DNA results, the letter, because the letter was the part that actually mattered, and hung it in my home office where I could see it every day I sat down to work. My mother and I speak rarely now, and when we do, it's brief, transactional, careful. She never apologized for what she said at the funeral, not directly, not in so many words. But she also never tried it again, not at any family gathering since, not in any phone call, because the documentation existed now, permanent and undeniable, and my mother, whatever else she was, understood the cost of a fight she'd already lost in writing. Cole and I are still figuring out what we are to each other. He sent me a text a few months later, short, awkward, the kind of message that comes from someone who knows he was wrong but doesn't quite have the words for it yet. I should have asked you what was actually true before I went along with what Mom wanted. I'm sorry. I didn't write back anything dramatic. I just said, thank you for saying that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door left open instead of slammed shut, and I've learned that some doors are worth leaving open a little, even after everything. Aunt Joyce and I talk every week now, the way I used to talk to my father. She tells me stories about him I never knew, the version of him before he was my dad, the version that existed before I was even born. Some of those stories make me laugh. Some of them make me cry in the good way, the way that feels like missing someone instead of grieving them. I think about that funeral reception sometimes, the paper plate in my hand, the cold porch air, the particular cruelty of a mother who chose her own son's husband's death as the moment to plant a knife. I think about how close I came to believing her, just for a moment in the shock of it, before the part of me my father had built, careful, patient, evidence-driven, took back over and refused to let a wine-glass accusation become the story of my life. My father knew his own wife well enough to arm his daughter against her from beyond the grave. That's not a small thing. That's a man who loved me so completely that even dying, even exhausted, even scared, he found the time to leave me proof, because he understood that love alone wouldn't be enough to protect me once he was gone. Love needed receipts. He gave me receipts. I am Daniel Ashworth's daughter. The math says so. The law says so. His handwriting says so, in a letter he wrote with hands that were already failing him, because he loved me enough to fight a battle he wouldn't live to see. That's my story. One funeral, one cruel sentence, and one quiet test that said everything my mother tried to take away was never hers to take in the first place. If someone in your life has ever tried to rewrite who you are using nothing but their own loud voice, I hope this reminds you that the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs time and patience and somebody willing to write it down. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.